March 22nd, 1668. The John and Lucy, a ship sailing from Rhode Island to New York Harbor, ran aground at Montauk Point in New York. The fierce winds crippled any courage the crew had to venture out into the pitch-black darkness to seek aid. So, they hunkered down for the night, rocks grinding against the hull, winds beating against the mast, and the cold seeping through their clothes. They wondered if the ship would break apart. But by morning, the ship held and the crew was still alive. Taking advantage of the light, some of the men rowed a boat to New London, Connecticut to find help. They succeeded, and all the crewmen survived. Montauk Point was becoming known as a hazardous location for maritime traffic. Its peninsula surrounded by jagged boulders and rocky ledges that could cut through a ship and end the lives of crewmen within minutes. A lighthouse was needed to guide mariners safely through the area, and by the end of the 1700s, Montauk Point Light was established, the first lighthouse built in New York, and the fourth oldest operating lighthouse in the United States. Today, we're diving into its history. I'm Carolina, and welcome to the Lighthouse Narrative. Montauk Point, a rocky bluff at the eastern end of Long Island, New York, was initially occupied by the Montaukett Indians. When European settlers arrived in the 1600s, they named the point Turtle Hill, as the bluff looked like a turtle's back. Despite its reputation, Montauk Point was a key location for economic reasons. Ships sailing from Europe usually spotted Montauk first before heading to New York Harbor. It became an important landmark for international trade, so in 1792, President George Washington commissioned for a lighthouse to be built at the point. John McComb was selected to construct it, especially as he came in with the lowest bid of $22,300. He was a New York contractor who also built Cape Henry Light in Virginia. After Montauk Point, he would later build Eaton's Neck Light in 1798. With a crew of 50 men consisting of blacksmiths, bricklayers, carpenters, and masons, construction began in 1796 and was completed in 5 months. John and his team built the lighthouse from sandstone, a keeper's dwelling, and a storage building. Upon completion, one of the first lighting apparatuses installed in the lantern room was a spider lamp. Spider lamps predate argon lamps, reflectors, and Fresnel lenses. These lamps were pans filled with oil, hung from the ceiling with chains. In the pan were 10 or more wicks that burned for about 12 hours or more. However, they were inefficient and the light they generated was poor. As it went into operation, the lighthouse served several purposes. It was foremost a landfall light for ships sailing from Europe. Many immigrants viewed it as a symbol of opportunity, sharing similar sentiments with the Statue of Liberty. It also directed ships to ports in New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Jacob Hand was the first keeper of Montauk Point at 64 years old, moving in with his wife Abigail Conkling and their son Jared, having 3 more children later. He became keeper on the condition his grandson, Josiah Hand, lived and worked with him as an assistant, to which his terms were accepted. Jacob worked at Montauk Point for 16 years, his wife having passed away halfway through his service. He ended up retiring in 1812 due to his deteriorating health. In the following year, he passed away. There was a bit of a problem in who would succeed him. Nothing on the level of Game of Thrones, but some politics did come into play. Sensing his impending retirement, Jacob recommended his son Jared as the next lighthouse keeper in 1808, as he was already working as an unofficial assistant. Many officials and proprietors at Montauk backed the recommendation. When they sent letters of support for Jacob's choice to President Thomas Jefferson, he was vehemently against it. I can only imagine his agitated scroll flying across the parchment while crafting his response. The president wasn't a fan of family members taking over the roles of lighthouse keeping, as that set the precedent for the role to be handed down through hereditary means and not through professional merit and expertise. Without the president's blessing, Jared wasn't allowed the job. Instead, if he wanted the role, he'd have to apply like everyone else who was interested. And so he did. When the pool of applicants was considered by a board of men, Jared was found to be the best candidate and was made the new keeper in 1812. That same year, the entire Hand family were forced off the property by the British, as the War of 1812 was in full swing. The British's usual MO when taking control of lighthouses was to destroy them, but fortunately, they didn't do so to Montauk Point as they felt it served advantageous to them because of its location. The family returned to the light in 1815, but with a new lighthouse keeper. Jared left his position in 1814, and his sister's husband, Henry Baker, took over. The couple was known as being hospitable and lovely when entertaining guests. In the early days, keeping boarders at the light was part of the job. However, Henry retired in 1832 when he was listed as having become deranged and melancholy. He passed away a year later at 52 years old, but we don't know what from. Around this time, a familiar man entered the scene, Felix Dominy. In my video on the history of Fire Island Light, I mentioned Felix was its keeper from 1835 to 1844. He was removed from his position due to negligence of duty. But what did he do before arriving at Fire Island? Felix came from a prominent family of craftsmen based in East Hampton, specializing in furniture, clockwork, and metalwork. He was heavily involved in the state militia since he was 18 years old. By the 1830s, Felix was having a sort of midlife crisis. His job wasn't very lucrative, and seeking more stability, he set his eyes on the lighthouse service. When he heard about Henry's retirement, he felt entitled to be Montauk Point's next lighthouse keeper. He petitioned President Andrew Jackson to make him keeper, although previous drafts of this letter were a bit more harsh and demanding in tone. It wouldn't matter though, as the position was awarded to someone else. Fun fact, Felix did contribute something to the lighthouse. He won a contract to cover Montauk Point's domed roof in copper. This was one of his last jobs as a craftsman before moving to Fire Island. Different lighting apparatuses were used at Montauk Point throughout its service. Argand lamps and reflectors replaced the spider lamp. Then in 1857, Montauk received a first order Fresnel lens as a gift from the French government, but the arrival of the lens was delayed. The collector of the port in New York wasn't given any instructions on where to send the lens, so it sat in a warehouse until some random person bought it for $70. Which is crazy, because Fresnel lenses at the time cost thousands and thousands of dollars. The US government was able to get it back, but they had to pay the buyer $900 for it. Another issue with the lens popped up when a new lighthouse, Shenanigans Light, was built halfway between Montauk Point and Fire Island. The John Milton, a ship built in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, was on a 15-month-long journey starting in 1856. Its main goal was to pick up a cargo of guano from the Chincha Islands off the Peruvian coast. Once the cargo was obtained, the ship headed for New York, where it ran into trouble. By the time the ship reached Long Island, a winter storm was brewing. Ephraim Harding, a 43-year-old captain from Martha's Vineyard, spotted a lighthouse in the distance through the storm. He mistakenly thought it was Montauk Point Light when in actuality, it was Shenanigans Light. The reason for the confusion is that both Montauk and Shenanigans lights shared the same light characteristic. Light characteristics refer to a navigational aid's distinctive light pattern, made up of a color, rhythm, and a sequence. Think of it as a sort of fingerprint that identifies what lighthouse a mariner sees at a specific location from a distance. In this case, both lighthouses had a fixed white light. Since they're located miles from each other, it's understandable that mariners would get confused at what lighthouse they were actually looking at. At some point during the John Milton's journey, Montauk Point altered its characteristic from a fixed light to a flashing one, the captain unaware of the change. On February 20th, 1858, due to his error, he misdirected the ship to steer north, causing it to run aground on a beach known today as the Ditch Plains, about 5 miles away from Montauk Point Light. The lighthouse keeper at the time, William Gardiner, organized a search party to rescue the crew. Upon arrival, they discovered a collection of frozen bodies lying across the beach. All crew on board, including Harding's son, perished in the crash. Another ship almost fell to the same danger. The Washington was sailing home from a whaling expedition, and as a side note, these kinds of expeditions involve the hunting of whales for their oil and meat to be turned into other products. The captain, Henry Babcock, made the same mistake Captain Harding did, but he didn't change his course. Since he took a reading of the sun's position earlier in the day, He realized it didn't make sense to see Montauk Point so soon. Relying on his years of experience, he ordered his crew to continue to steer the ship east until Montauk Point Light was in sight, saving his crew from disaster. Funnily enough, he'd become the lighthouse's keeper in the future. James G. Scott is the most notable keeper at Montauk Point, having served the longest at 25 years. He was born in England on May 16, 1840. He migrated to the United States around 1858 and joined the lighthouse service at 19 years old. His first assignment was a cook on the Stratford Shoal lightship. After serving in the Civil War, he was appointed second assistant at Stratford Shoal Light in 1877. The next year, he became first assistant at Stepping Stones. He then returned to Stratford Shoal as its principal keeper. Before James transferred to Montauk Point, the light station received several upgrades between the 1830s to the 1870s. 2 keepers' dwellings were added to the property, a fog signal was installed, and the lighthouse was made taller. The lantern was rebuilt to better accommodate the first order lens, but a 3.5 order bivalve lens replaced it in 1903. The Scotts would be around when the lighthouse's day mark was updated when a brown strip was painted on its exterior. James, his wife Margaret Stanton, and their children moved to Montauk Point in 1885. The couple was documented as having 5 children, and unfortunately, many of them met tragic fates at the lighthouse. David Scott, just a baby, was already deceased long before the family arrived at Montauk, but it wasn't known what he passed from. 2 more children fell victim to different ailments in 1885. Anna from scarlet fever at 15 years old, and her brother John from appendicitis. In 1898, 14-year-old Walter Scott and his friend made their way to Money Pond, just north of the lighthouse, to ride their rowboat. When the boat capsized, Walter became entangled in the boat's ropes while his friend swam to shore. In a state of shock, the friend made his way to the lighthouse and stood anxiously by the kitchen doorway, watching Margaret prepare dinner. Upon noticing him, Margaret asked, "It's dinner time. Where is Walter?" The boy replied, "Oh, he's drowned." James recovered his son's body from the pond and took him to an undertaker to prepare for a burial. The only child to survive to adulthood was Emily Scott. She and her mother walked 4 miles to retrieve their mail, as even in the 1800s the location was still very isolated. She also entertained and conversed with survivors of shipwrecks who stayed at the lighthouse until they could leave. One of them, a captain's sister, gifted Emily an amethyst ring that became a family heirloom. Many of her friends visited the lighthouse, some of them stranded there when the weather grew too severe. At one point, she thought of the location as the loneliest place on earth, but as she grew older, realized some of her best memories were at the light. She later married James Strong, bringing him and their children to visit her parents at the lighthouse. As for James, he was known as a reliant, dependable, and hard-working man. He was the first keeper at Montauk to wear an official uniform of the lighthouse establishment. He was also known for making Montauk pudding, a chocolate bread pudding that became popular when a schooner carrying a cargo of cocoa beans ran aground near the point. As the cargo washed ashore, locals included the beans in different recipes, like Montauk pudding. Near the end of his service, some assistants complained that James was too old to work at the light station. The Lighthouse Board offered him a position at a light in Staten Island, but he declined. In 1910, he retired at 70 years old and shortly after passed away, presumably from complications with diabetes. The bluff where the lighthouse sits has been slowly eroding away for centuries, being constantly exposed to the incoming tides and fierce winds, crumbling away layers of rock and earth. First signs of erosion were noted as early as the late 1700s, but surveys of the location only popped up in the 1920s to investigate the situation further. Not only were the tides and winds shrinking the size of the bluff, but so was rainfall and the powerful vibrations from the foghorn at the station. Early steps taken to slow erosion included placing a fence around the station to reduce foot traffic and a stone revetment, typically a protective facing made of stone on the shoreline, but these steps didn't prove all that useful. The fence was destroyed and the revetment collapsed, By the 1950s, for everyone's safety, the public was no longer allowed to walk the lighthouse grounds. There were conflicting opinions within the Coast Guard on how to address the problem. On one hand, the Coast Guard announced an automated beacon would replace the station, but the lighthouse itself would be preserved as a historical site. On the other hand, a spokesperson deemed it a waste of taxpayer dollars to try and save the lighthouse from erosion. The public got involved when Dan Ratner, an editor of the Montauk Pioneer and Dan's papers, published an article bringing attention to the issue by using a photo of Shinnecock Light being demolished by the Coast Guard. Shinnecock Light served as a cautionary tale on historical preservation and loss. The photo worked. Public outcry grew at the potential loss of the lighthouse, and in 1970, the Coast Guard backed out of their plans of automation. A solution eventually came from a New York City photographer and designer, Georgina Reed. Georgina developed a method called Reed Trench Terracing after experiencing coastal erosion that threatened her waterfront cottage in Rocky Point, Long Island. Her method involved packing reeds tight with sand behind pieces of lumber, creating terrace levels on a slope to stabilize the bluff. While the Coast Guard were reluctant to try out this method, especially as Georgina wasn't an engineer, all their other attempts had failed, so she began work in 1970, the endeavor known as the Montauk Point Erosion Control Project. She toiled away for years, working a few times a week for a few hours a day, unable to get federal, state, or local funding. You may be thinking, didn't the Coast Guard pay for the project? Well, no. Georgina had signed a contract that cautioned against the dangers of the bluff, with an included warning that the Coast Guard wouldn't expense the project. It was instead supported by volunteers, local donations, and by Georgina herself, who shelled out up to $40,000. For her efforts, she was honored in 1986 at the Lighthouse for her dedication and work to save it. When she retired by 1987, erosion efforts were given more attention by official authorities and organizations, who were able to get funding to stabilize the bluffs with a large stone revetment. The Montauk Historical Society was incorporated in 1962 to help preserve the lighthouse. They were able to lease the property from the Coast Guard in 1987, when the 3.5 bivalve Fresnel lens was replaced by an automated beacon. The lens was moved into the newly created museum on the property for visitors to view. Presently, the lens has returned to its rightful place in the lantern room, flashing a white light every 5 seconds, seen from a distance of 19 nautical miles. The Society eventually bought the property in 1986, and while they maintain the grounds, the Coast Guard is still responsible for managing the light. Montauk Point continues to sit on the beautiful bluff at the end of Long Island, surrounded by parkland, beaches, and a community that has developed since the 1900s. It's a historical landmark, a navigational aid, and a reminder of how lighthouses still serve a purpose and have earned their place in history. Thank you for tuning in to the history of Montauk Point Light. Join me next time as we continue to explore lighthouse history and the story of its keepers. Until then, happy lighthouse hunting.